1990, a teenage girl from Oregon disappeared without a trace, leaving her parents trapped in limbo for more than 2 decades. But 22 years later, her father opens her old high school yearbook, and what he notices flips everything they thought they knew upside down. The morning fog drifted in from the Pacific, like it always did, swallowing up the coastal town of Mornington, Oregon. From the window of his daughter's room, Frank Sanders watched the mist curl around the distant lighthouse. That view had once brought peace, until the day Alicia vanished. Since then, the same cliffs and woods had become a quiet reminder of everything they'd lost. Frank turned from the window and looked around the bedroom. It was still frozen in time. Posters on the wall, notebooks stacked neatly on her desk, clothes hanging untouched in the closet, exactly as Alicia had left them just weeks after finishing high school. "It's time," he murmured, remembering what he and his wife Elaine had finally agreed to the night before. After 22 years, they had to face the truth. Alicia wasn't coming back. Today, they would begin packing her things. Some would be donated to children in need, some stored in the attic, and some kept as memories too precious to part with. Frank opened the window to let in fresh air, stirring up years of dust. He sneezed, wiped his eyes, and began carefully sorting through her clothes. Her favorite blue sweater, the prom dress, those jeans she used to customize with her own patches, each item came with a memory. Then he reached her school supplies. That's where he paused. These weren't just old notebooks. They were pieces of her future, a future she never got to live. Alicia had been accepted to the University of Oregon to study marine biology. As Frank gently moved textbooks aside, he spotted something unexpected: her senior yearbook. Somehow, in all these years, he'd never opened it. Back then, it had just hurt too much. He sat on the edge of her bed and opened the book. The glossy pages felt heavy, like they were carrying part of Alicia's life he hadn't touched since she disappeared. And there she was, her senior portrait. That bright, hopeful smile still had the power to hit him right in the chest. 22 years, he whispered, tracing her face with his fingertip. "I have to find a way to remember you without breaking." Then his eyes landed on the photo beside hers, Amy Davidson, Alicia's best friend. Frank remembered the sleepovers, the whispered secrets, Amy laughing at their dinner table. After Alicia disappeared, Amy had stayed in touch for a while, but eventually, those visits stopped. Frank hadn't heard her name in years. Curious, he flipped to the section with student bios. Each senior had a profile with a personal quote. Alicia's read, "Thanks to Mom and Dad for always believing in me, to my teachers who never gave up on me, and to my best friend Amy, don't forget to return my book, The Secret Garden, illustrated classic edition. You old grandma, love you forever." Frank let out a quiet chuckle. That little jab, "you old grandma," was exactly their kind of joke. Then he turned to Amy's page. Her write-up was full of ambition and confidence, following dreams, standing strong, becoming who you are. That's when Frank remembered the book. Alicia loved The Secret Garden. She had several versions of it, each one special to her. But the illustrated edition, had Amy ever brought it back? Frank couldn't remember seeing it since. Driven by something he couldn't quite explain, he began searching through the boxes. Dust stung his eyes and made him cough, so he carried everything into the living room for better light and air. He laid out the books across the floor: fantasy novels, science books, wildlife magazines, but no sign of the illustrated Secret Garden. Maybe Amy still had it? Frank went back to the yearbook and flipped to the back. There it was, Amy's handwriting, right next to her photo. She had scribbled her number with a cheerful note: "Call me anytime, BFF." On impulse, Frank picked up his phone and dialed the number, not expecting much after 2 decades. As expected, the line was no longer active. Just then, the front door creaked open. Elaine stepped inside with grocery bags, unaware that something had just shifted in the air. Something small, but significant. And it all started with a book. Elaine stepped through the door, fresh from the farmer's market, but stopped cold when she saw the living room. Books, magazines, and old papers were scattered everywhere like a storm had passed through. "Frank, what is all this?" Her voice was sharp, not just with surprise, but with something deeper. Maybe grief, maybe frustration. Frank stood up from the floor. "I was just going through Alicia's things, like we talked about." Elaine's expression tightened. "We agreed to sort and store her things, not cover the entire house with them. I thought we were ready to move forward, not fall back into this." "I'm not falling back," Frank said calmly. "I found her yearbook. I was looking for something." Elaine set the grocery bags down a little harder than necessary. "Frank, it's just a book. After all this time, what could possibly be worth digging through all this again?" Frank held up the yearbook and pointed to a note Alicia had written. "She mentioned a book Amy borrowed, The Secret Garden, the illustrated edition. I was just curious if it was still here." Elaine let out a long breath. "Frank, that doesn't matter anymore. Her books have been sitting there for decades. Why chase down one that's probably long gone? Amy's likely forgotten all about it." Frank didn't answer her directly. Instead, he asked, "Do you know where Amy is now?" Elaine paused, then nodded slowly. "I see her now and then in town. She lives in a camper these days." Frank hesitated, then said quietly, "I was thinking maybe I'll go see her. Not just about the book. It's been years since we last spoke. She was practically family once." Elaine turned to him, her expression firm. "Frank, not today. I don't have anything against Amy, but I'm not ready for that. Last night we agreed to let go, to clean, donate, and move on. Going to see Amy feels like doing the opposite." She motioned to the mess around them. "I'll stay here and get everything packed for the attic like we planned. If you feel like you need to go, that's your call." Frank nodded. He understood. This wasn't easy for either of them. It was just a thought. "I'll go alone." Elaine gave him directions to where Amy usually parked her camper, but as he gathered his phone, keys, and the yearbook, she added a final word of caution. "Just don't press her too hard." Alicia's disappearance affected her too. They were inseparable. Frank stepped out into the gray mist of Mornington, the yearbook clutched to his chest like a compass pointing towards something unfinished. He drove along winding coastal roads, past pine trees and cliffs soaked in fog, until he reached the edge of town. The camper lot was quiet, tucked near a wooded bluff with about a dozen RVs parked in a row. Some looked like they'd been there for years, complete with tiny gardens and folding chairs outside. Frank approached a man cleaning the windows of his RV. "Excuse me, do you know where Amy Davidson's camper is?" The man wiped his hands on a towel and nodded. "Far end, blue and white one. She's nice. Keeps to herself, mostly." Frank thanked him and walked over. The camper was tidy, modest, with a small potted plant beside the door. He took a steadying breath and knocked. After a pause, the door creaked open. A woman in her early 40s stood there, her blonde hair now streaked with gray. Her eyes held no recognition, just polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked. Frank realized with a jolt that she didn't recognize him. Of course not. They hadn't seen each other in over 20 years. "Amy, it's Frank Sanders, Alicia's father." Her expression shifted in an instant. Surprise, then emotion, memories surfacing behind her eyes. "Mr. Sanders, oh wow." She opened the door wider. "Please come in." Frank climbed the small steps into a compact but warm space. The camper was clean, cozy, filled with plants, photos, and personality. "Would you like some coffee?" Amy asked, motioning toward the small dining area. "That'd be nice, thank you," Frank said, taking a seat. As she moved around the kitchen space, he noticed how careful she seemed, like she was still adjusting to the moment. "What brings you here after all this time?" she asked, setting a steaming mug in front of him before sitting across the table. Frank pulled the yearbook from his bag and placed it gently on the table. I found this while cleaning out Alicia's room today. I realized I'd never actually looked through it. Amy looked down at the cover and slowly reached out, her fingers resting on it like touching a memory. I remember this, she said softly. Frank opened to Alicia's profile and pointed at the handwritten note. She mentioned a book, The Secret Garden, said she loaned it to you. Amy's face relaxed into a quiet, bittersweet smile. No, I never gave it back. I was terrible about stuff like that back then. Alicia always teased me about it. She stood up and walked to a cabinet. Amy knelt beside the built-in cabinet beneath her bed. After a few moments of quiet rummaging, she pulled out a worn hardcover copy of The Secret Garden, the illustrated edition Alicia had loved. Its corners were soft with age, the cover slightly faded. I always meant to give it back, Amy said, holding it gently, almost reverently. But after she disappeared, I just couldn't let it go. It's the only piece of her I had left. She looked up at Frank, eyes asking permission before she even spoke the words. Would you mind terribly if I kept it? It's come to mean a lot to me. Frank nodded without hesitation. Of course, it belongs with you. Still, when she handed it over briefly for him to look through, he couldn't help but open it. The pages were yellowed, but the illustrations were as vivid as ever. Halfway through, he paused. Something was tucked inside. It was a torn page from a teen fashion magazine, clearly used as a makeshift bookmark. He unfolded it and found a glossy photo spread featuring young models. One of them, a boy in trendy clothes, stood out. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing at the familiar face. Amy leaned in for a closer look. Jason Murray, he was in our class. Frank flipped through the yearbook again and found Jason's photo not far from Alicia's. I remember now. He did some modeling even back then, didn't he? Amy nodded. He still does now and then. I think he even started his own fashion brand. Frank's brow furrowed slightly. Elaine once mentioned you were dating him back then. I never really gave it much thought. Amy's expression shifted immediately. That's not true. I never dated Jason. I actually didn't like him at all. Neither did Alicia. At least, not after we got to know him better. That caught Frank off guard. Alicia? She never told us anything about him. Amy thought for a moment. It was during junior year. Jason had a bit of a crush on her, and for a while they were friendly. But once we saw how he really acted, controlling, kind of secretive, we both kept our distance. Or at least, I thought we did. She paused again, like another memory was surfacing. Actually, I do remember Alicia talking to him a few times senior year. I thought it was odd, considering we'd agreed he wasn't someone to trust. What kind of things did she say about him? Frank asked, now fully attentive. She asked me if I thought someone like Jason could change, Amy replied. If maybe people misunderstood him. Once she even asked me to drive past his house, said she just wanted to see where he lived. It felt strange at the time, but Alicia always had a soft heart. She looked for good in everyone. Did the police know about this? Frank asked quietly. Yes. I mentioned it during the investigation, Amy said. They talked to everyone in our class, including Jason. But Alicia was dating Brandon Knox by then, and he became their focus. Frank nodded slowly. Brandon. Yeah, he came around the house a few times. Elaine and I never felt right about him, but he had an airtight alibi. Last I heard, Amy added, Brandon left town not long after it all happened. Too much pressure, I think. Frank's thoughts were spinning. And Jason? Do you know where he ended up? I don't know much, Amy said. Alicia never seemed especially close to him, aside from those few conversations. Frank looked again at the magazine page. Why would she use his photo as a bookmark? Amy smiled sadly. That page was from her favorite magazine. I actually remember when she tore it out. I told her I couldn't stand him, and she just folded the page and said it was the perfect use for his face. Frank exhaled through his nose, half amused, half unnerved. "Do you know where he is now?" Amy picked up her phone and scrolled through messages. "Our alumni group had a reunion last weekend. At Jason's house, actually. I didn't go, but they shared his address in the group chat." She held up the screen. "Would you mind sending that to me?" Frank asked, pulling out his phone. They exchanged numbers, and Amy forwarded the message. "Do you think he could have been involved somehow?" she asked gently. "I'm not sure," Frank said. "But if Alicia had even a short connection with him, one we never knew about, I think the authorities should know, especially since everything with Brandon was always out in the open." Frank stood, thanking Amy for her time. As he headed toward the door, she placed a hand on his arm. "Tell Elaine I said hello, and thank you for letting me keep the book. It means more than you could know." Frank nodded, Yearbook tucked securely under his arm, and stepped out into the cool afternoon light. His mind wasn't settled, far from it. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel stuck. He sat in the car, the yearbook resting beside him. The image of Jason's face on that torn magazine page lingered in his thoughts. Alicia's past was starting to reveal pieces he'd never seen, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to connect them. It wasn't just that Alicia had once spoken to Jason. It was the fact that neither Frank nor Elaine had ever known about it. That alone made Frank uneasy. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of Detective Ron Keller, the officer who'd been in charge of Alicia's case all those years ago. Keller was retired now, but still lived in Mornington. Unsurprisingly, the call went to voicemail. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Frank stared at the screen, then at the address Amy had sent. He knew he should go home. He and Elaine had promised each other they'd finally put this chapter behind them today. But Amy's comments, and that bookmark, kept turning over in his mind. Alicia's questions about Jason, her sudden curiosity about where he lived, and the fact that she had once thought he might just be misunderstood. It didn't sit right. "Just a quick drive by," Frank muttered, turning the ignition. "Just to see." About 20 minutes later, Frank found himself in one of the nicer neighborhoods, just outside Mornington. The kind with wide lawns, tall hedges, and mailboxes that looked hand-painted. He located Jason's address easily. A large, modern two-story home with a circular driveway and perfectly trimmed hedges. The kind of house that spoke of quiet success. It was a far cry from the modest home Frank and Elaine had raised Alicia in. He parked across the street, staying in the car. The front gate stood open. After a moment, the door to the house swung open, and a man in his early 40s stepped out, walking a younger woman to her car. Even from this distance, Frank could tell it was him, Jason Murray. The face was older, sharper, but still recognizable from that old magazine clipping. Jason smiled at the woman, kissed her on the cheek, and waved as she drove away. Then, as he turned back toward the house, his eyes locked on Frank's car across the street. Frank froze. Too late, he realized his windows weren't tinted. Jason's posture changed immediately, shoulders squared, gaze narrowed. Alert, suspicious. No point in pretending now. Frank turned off the engine and stepped out. He approached the gate slowly, careful to keep his voice neutral. "Good afternoon. Jason Murray, right?" Jason didn't respond with a greeting. Instead, his tone was clipped and defensive. "Who are you? And why are you watching my house?" "I'm sorry," Frank said, stopping a few feet from the gate. "I didn't mean to alarm you. My name is Frank Sanders. Alicia Sanders was my daughter." Jason's eyes sharpened. "What do you want?" Frank hesitated for a beat, caught off guard by the intensity in Jason's voice. "I heard there was a reunion here last weekend. I'm just trying to learn a little more about Alicia's final year. Someone mentioned you might have been close to her." "Who told you that?" Jason snapped. "Amy," Frank said simply. "She didn't even come to the reunion." Frank kept his tone steady. "I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm just trying to understand. It's been over 2 decades, and We still don't know what happened." Jason crossed his arms. "Why ask me? I wasn't her boyfriend. I barely even talked to her. I told the police everything back then." Frank blinked. "I never said you were her boyfriend." Jason didn't seem to hear him. "If we ever interacted, it was probably because I needed help with homework or borrowed lunch money. That's all. There was never anything more to it." His words were flippant, but his body language told a different story. He was restless, shifting from foot to foot, glancing around the street like he didn't want to be seen talking to Frank. "I don't get why you're here," Jason continued. "I've built a life. I have a reputation now. I don't need some stranger digging up stories that were never true." Before Frank could say another word, Jason turned sharply and began walking back toward the house. "You should go," he said over his shoulder. "I've got nothing to say about Alicia Sanders." Frank stood in stunned silence, the gate still open in front of him. He hadn't expected warmth, but it was like touching a nerve he didn't even know existed. Why would a man so far removed from that time react with so much agitation to such simple questions? He walked slowly back to his car, hands trembling slightly as he gripped the wheel. He felt foolish, ashamed even, for coming, for ignoring Elaine's wishes, for chasing a shadow of the past. "What was I thinking?" he muttered under his breath. "We were supposed to be done with this." He started the car and pulled away, casting one last glance at Jason's house in the rearview mirror. If Elaine found out where he'd gone, she'd be hurt, disappointed, and rightfully so. They had agreed to clean, to sort, to let go, not stir old dust. As he headed back toward town, Frank tried to convince himself that Jason's behavior was just discomfort, a man annoyed by an unexpected visit linked to an event he'd long buried. And maybe that's all it was. Maybe. But deep down, something still didn't feel right. Frank couldn't shake it. Jason's defensiveness. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It felt alarmed. Excessive even. Was it really just the shock of being approached on a quiet Sunday afternoon? Or was there something deeper behind his reaction? Frank gripped the steering wheel tighter and forced his eyes back on the road. He had promised Elaine they would take a step forward today, not fall back into the past. He needed to honor that. Still, as he passed familiar streets on his way back into Mornington, his mind kept looping through the encounter. Jason's tone, the way he avoided eye contact, the almost panicked way he shut the conversation down, it didn't sit right. Frank had been through enough interviews over the years to know when someone was just irritated and when they were nervous. Almost without realizing it, Frank found himself pulling into the parking lot of Mornington Memorial Funeral Home. Maybe this was what closure looked like, planning a simple memorial for Alicia. Even without a resting place, it might help them move forward. The building was quiet and still. Inside, a kind receptionist greeted him and gently handed him brochures outlining the services and costs. Frank thanked her and stepped back out into the afternoon light, flipping through the papers as he approached his car. Then something caught his eye. Across the street, Jason Murray had just exited a hardware store. Frank froze, watching as Jason walked to the register with a shovel tucked under one arm and a small wooden box in hand. He paid, then stepped out into the sunlight. Frank ducked into his car, trying not to be noticed. Moments later, Jason entered the flower shop next door. When he reappeared, he was holding a bouquet of white hyacinths. White hyacinths. Frank's breath caught in his throat. They had been Alicia's favorite since she was a little girl. It could have been coincidence. Plenty of people liked those flowers, but the shovel, the box, the flowers, and Jason's earlier reaction all combined into a weight in Frank's chest he couldn't ignore. He watched as Jason placed everything into his trunk and drove off. And before he had time to reconsider, Frank started his own engine and followed, keeping far enough behind not to be noticed. Jason's car wound through town, then veered onto the scenic coastal road leading toward Whitlow Cliff, a dramatic stretch overlooking the Pacific, known more for its view than for its few isolated cottages. Frank followed at a distance as Jason turned onto a gravel driveway leading to a small, secluded cottage perched near the cliffside. Frank drove past, then parked further up the road where tall trees offered cover. From there, he watched. Jason exited the cottage moments later, carrying a small garden cart. Inside were the shovel, the wooden box, the bouquet of hyacinths, and a gallon jug of water. With slow, deliberate movements, he made his way down a narrow trail leading toward the cliff's edge. Frank slipped out of his car and moved quietly through the trees, keeping Jason in view, but far enough behind to remain hidden. The path twisted through low pines and wildflowers before opening to a private overlook with a stunning view of the ocean. Frank crouched behind a rock formation, his heart beating faster with every step Jason took toward the edge. Jason paused near a flat patch of ground. He looked around, once, twice, then began digging. The earth was rocky and resisted him. The way he worked made it clear this wasn't a casual task. Sweat darkened his shirt, and still he kept going, carving a hole about 2 feet deep. Once satisfied, Jason set down the shovel and opened the wooden box. From Frank's vantage point, he couldn't see the contents, but he could see the way Jason looked at them. His posture shifted. He wasn't rushing. In fact, he seemed lost in whatever he was holding. His lips moved, silently at first, reading, praying. Then came a gust of wind. Loose papers burst from the box and scattered in all directions. Jason swore under his breath, slammed the lid closed, and scrambled to retrieve what had blown free. Frank stayed low, barely breathing, watching as Jason gathered the papers one by one. When everything was back in place, Jason lowered the box into the hole. He gently laid the bouquet on top, then began covering it all with soil. His movements were slow, deliberate, more ritual than chore. When the ground was level again, Jason poured water from the jug over the fresh soil, tamping it down with both hands. Then he stood, silent, still, and then he spoke. "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." Frank recoiled, the name hitting him like a punch to the chest. His foot slipped on the loose gravel behind the rock. He caught himself quickly, pressing against the tree beside him, clamping his hand over his mouth to keep from gasping. His heart pounded, louder than the wind, louder than the waves. Jason's head snapped up. "Hello?" he called sharply, his voice slicing through the ocean breeze. "Is someone there?" Frank froze. Jason picked up the shovel and stepped toward the brush. Closer, then another step. Frank didn't move, didn't breathe. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but he stayed rooted to the spot, hidden in the trees, hoping whatever came next wouldn't shatter everything. Frank pressed his back against the tree trunk, barely breathing, silently praying the shadows would keep him hidden. After what felt like forever, Jason muttered to himself, "Just the wind," though his tone suggested he wasn't fully convinced. He lingered for a moment, eyes scanning the trees, then slowly began circling the clearing's edge, checking the perimeter before finally heading back toward the cottage. Frank didn't move until Jason had vanished from sight. He stayed frozen, counting slowly to 100 to be certain. When all remained quiet, he emerged from hiding. His legs were shaky beneath him, but his resolve held steady. He had to know. Frank returned to the site near the cliff's edge, now marked by freshly packed earth. His heart pounded. What had Jason buried here? Why had he said Alicia's name? Near the cottage, Jason had leaned the shovel against the side wall. Frank retrieved it, walked back to the site, and began digging. His movements were fast but careful. The soil was damp and soft. In just a few minutes, he uncovered the bouquet of white hyacinths, Alicia's favorite, still fragrant, despite the earth clinging to their stems. Then his shovel struck something solid. Before he could remove the box, a voice behind him sliced through the sound of the ocean. "I knew someone was out there. I was right." Frank spun around, Jason stood a few yards away, eyes burning with fury. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, stepping forward. "I saw your car parked up the hill, so I circled through the trees. What do you think you're doing?" Frank gripped the shovel tighter, not just as a tool now, but as a line between him and danger. "I heard you say my daughter's name," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What does Alicia have to do with this? What are you hiding?" Jason's face twisted. "You don't know what you're talking about. You shouldn't be here." Frank turned back to the shallow grave. "I'm going to find out what's in this box." "Stop!" Jason shouted. Then he pulled a gun. "Drop the shovel!" Frank froze. Slowly, he raised his hands, keeping his eyes on Jason. In one motion, he used his free hand to pull out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said. "They need to see this. Go ahead, shoot me if you want, but I'm one button away from alerting them." Jason lunged forward. With a quick swipe, he knocked the phone from Frank's hand. It skidded toward the edge of the cliff. "No!" Frank shouted. He dove forward, just in time to snatch the phone before it slipped away. At the same moment, he kicked upward, knocking the gun from Jason's grip. It tumbled over the cliff and vanished. Frank didn't hesitate. He pressed the emergency button on his phone, sending his GPS to local authorities. "The police are coming," he said. "You can still tell the truth, Jason. Alicia is gone. Hiding the truth won't change that." "You don't understand," Jason snapped, his voice cracking with panic. "I still have a future, a company, a reputation. I can't let this ruin me." Frank's voice broke. "Did you hurt my daughter?" he asked. "She was all we had. If you cared about her, how could you—" "I never knew what I felt for her," Jason said, eyes wild. "She should have stayed away. I told her to. But she kept showing up. You didn't see the way she looked at me. You didn't know her like I did. Then why bury this out here? Why hide?" Frank demanded. "She betrayed me," Jason roared, voice full of something twisted and uncontrolled. Without warning, he lunged again, this time slamming Frank backward and grabbing him by the throat. Frank struggled, gasping, trying to break free from Jason's grip. But he was older, weaker. The edges of his vision began to blur. Then, sirens. The sound cut through the air like a blade. Jason's grip faltered. He turned, startled, as multiple police vehicles came speeding up the private road. Sirens wailed. Tires crunched over gravel. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn. "Let him go! Step back! Hands where we can see them!" A voice barked. Jason let go. The shovel clattered to the ground as two officers rushed forward and restrained him, securing him in handcuffs and reading him his rights. Frank collapsed to his knees, coughing, struggling to catch his breath. A female officer reached him. "Are you all right, sir?" Frank nodded, voice hoarse. "Yeah, thank you." As Jason was led away toward the nearest patrol car, Frank pointed back to the burial site. "There," he said, still catching his breath. "He buried something. Said my daughter's name, Alicia Sanders. She went missing 22 years ago." The officer's expression shifted. Serious, focused. She motioned to her colleagues. "Secure the site. And get forensics out here now." Frank stood in the breeze, the Pacific wind in his hair, watching as officers moved toward the shallow grave, toward the box Jason had tried so hard to hide. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Hope. The officer's demeanor shifted immediately. "Sanders, I remember that case." Her tone turned serious. "Let me get Detective Ramirez over here." As officers worked to secure the area, a man in plain clothes approached Frank and handed him back his phone. "I'm Detective Ramirez. Can you tell me what brought you out here today?" Frank recounted everything, finding the yearbook, visiting Amy, the encounter with Jason at his home, and how that strange interaction led him here. "I know I shouldn't have followed him," Frank admitted, "but when I saw him buy a shovel and white hyacinths, Alicia's favorite flower, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong." Detective Ramirez nodded thoughtfully. You said he buried something? Frank pointed toward the freshly packed mound of earth. Yes, a wooden box and the flowers. Before he buried it, the wind blew some papers out, and he scrambled to collect them. Then he said something strange. He said, "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." Ramirez turned and signaled the nearby forensics team. "Let's take a look." Frank stood quietly as the specialists moved in. Every passing second tightened the knot in his chest. The first thing they uncovered was the bouquet of white hyacinths, still fragrant beneath the soil. Then came the box, a simple wooden container, sealed but unmarked. Gloved and careful, the lead technician opened it. Inside was a stack of old papers, some handwritten notes, faded photographs, and printed text messages. There was also a small handmade doll, the kind children craft in school, soft, colorful yarn wrapped tightly into shape. Frank's breath caught. He said Alicia could have it now. That means he's been holding on to these things for over 20 years. Detective Ramirez began to sort through the contents, carefully lifting the top layer, a series of messages, printed from an old phone or email archive. Her brow furrowed as she read. "Mr. Sanders," she said gently, "these messages suggest that Jason and Alicia had a hidden relationship back in high school, one that appears to have become complicated over time." Frank stepped closer, watching in silence as Ramirez turned page after page. The early messages were innocent enough, plans with friends, notes about school, but then came a text thread where Jason specifically asked Alicia not to invite Amy to a group outing. That same night, he kissed her. Alicia's response was clear. She hadn't wanted it, but what followed was more difficult. The messages showed Alicia trying to understand him, believe in him. She said she saw something good in him, that he just needed someone to care. Jason never committed to her. His replies were vague, at times dismissive, at times emotionally manipulative. Alicia's messages grew increasingly anxious, confused, hopeful. Over the span of nearly a year, it was clear she had been emotionally caught between loyalty and discomfort. Eventually, Alicia started pulling away. The tone of the texts shifted, less forgiving, more assertive. And when she began dating Brandon Knox, Jason's messages turned cold, then erratic, angry, possessive. Among the photos in the box were several that made Frank turn away in disbelief. Alicia appeared restrained, her expression filled with fear. The surroundings in the background, wood paneling, a rustic fireplace, matched the cottage Jason had just come from. Others were clearly taken outdoors in wooded areas that looked hauntingly familiar. Detective Ramirez quietly turned them face down. Handwriting covered the backs. They recognized Jason's. One photograph had the same lines scrawled over and over. "You must still love me. You must still love me." Another read, "Had a great time at the cliffs with you. Yours, Jay." But the final photo was the one that silenced everyone. Alicia's expression was fearful, her eyes wide and teary. On the back, Jason had written a rambling message, chaotic, filled with contradictions. He accused her of turning on him, of refusing to listen. He wrote that others were closing in and that she refused to talk things out. The last line stopped Frank cold. "I had to do it. They would have found us both. You'll always be with me, even if no one ever knows." Detective Ramirez exchanged a grim glance with another officer. "We'll need to question him again. He doesn't describe what happened clearly, but this changes everything." As the forensic team continued documenting the box, another group of officers arrived from deeper in the wooded area, one of them waving urgently. "Detective," she called out, "we've found something, about 15 feet that way. Soil disturbance. Initial dig revealed bone fragments." Frank's knees gave out. He sank to the ground, his chest tight with grief. After 22 years of searching, hoping, and imagining every possible outcome, The truth had finally begun to surface. The forensic team moved swiftly. Ramirez placed a reassuring hand on Frank's shoulder. "We'll do everything by the book, but Mr. Sanders, it looks like we may finally have answers." Frank looked toward the cliff, the ocean below glowing in the late afternoon sun. His heart was heavy, but beneath the weight, there was something else rising: clarity. As the forensic team continued their careful work, more of Alicia's remains were revealed. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden beams over the cliffside, illuminating the quiet, sacred task at hand. Detective Ramirez approached Frank, who had remained seated in silence, watching every movement with aching patience. "Mr. Sanders," she said gently, "would you like us to call your wife? She should be here." Frank nodded. "Yes, and please call Amy Davidson too. She was Alicia's best friend. She should know." Ramirez gave a respectful nod and stepped away to make the calls. Frank remained where he was. When the detective offered to escort him to the station to wait, he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I need to stay. Elaine and Amy should see this, all of it, before anything is moved. We've waited 22 years for answers. I'm staying until the end." An hour later, Elaine arrived. She rushed to Frank, her face pale with shock. They embraced tightly, holding on to each other as Ramirez gently explained what had been found. Amy arrived soon after, her eyes swollen from crying on the drive over. The three of them stood side by side, watching silently as the full truth of Alicia's fate was brought into the light. Elaine turned to the detective. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. "We want to bring her home. She deserves to rest somewhere peaceful, not here." Ramirez placed a comforting hand on Elaine's shoulder. "We'll make sure of that. As soon as the forensic team finishes their work, arrangements can be made. It should only take a day or two." Amy stepped closer to the burial site. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the delicate evidence of her friend's final resting place. "Why didn't you tell me, Alicia?" she whispered. "We always talked about how to avoid guys like Jason. We laughed about it. I could have helped you. I just don't understand." The sun dipped lower, shadows growing longer across the cliffs. Frank, Elaine, and Amy remained there, holding on to each other, united by pain, love, and finally, truth. "She's coming home," Frank whispered, squeezing Elaine's hand. "She's finally coming home." A week later, the sea was calm. A small flotilla of boats floated just off the Mornington coast near the base of Whitlow Cliff. It was an unusually clear day, with sunlight dancing across the gentle Pacific waves. In the lead boat stood Frank and Elaine Sanders, with Amy Davidson at their side. Detective Ramirez was there too, alongside retired Detective Ron Keller, who had come out of retirement to witness the closure of a case that had once defined his career. In the surrounding boats were Alicia's classmates, her former teachers, and the principal from Mornington High School. News of Jason Murray's arrest and the discovery of Alicia's remains had traveled fast. The town, long scarred by her disappearance, was now coming together to honor her return. Frank stood at the bow, a small urn in his hands. He and Elaine had chosen not to place Alicia in a traditional cemetery. They had talked for hours, and in the end, they decided she should rest where she had always felt most at peace: at sea. "Today," the minister began, "we gather to finally say goodbye to Alicia Sanders. For over 2 decades, her loved ones have carried the weight of not knowing. Today, that burden begins to lift." Elaine stepped forward, hand resting on Frank's arm. "Alicia loved the ocean," she said, her voice carrying softly over the waves. "She dreamed of becoming a marine biologist. She would have loved knowing she's becoming part of the water she cherished so deeply." Frank opened the urn. Together, he and Elaine released Alicia's ashes into the sea. As they drifted, White hyacinths, Alicia's favorite, were tossed from every boat, creating a floating garden of remembrance. Amy came forward last. She held the worn, cherished copy of The Secret Garden, the book she had meant to return for years. She placed it gently on the water's surface and whispered through her tears, "Goodbye, my friend. I'm sorry I never gave this back." As the boats made their way toward shore, Detective Ramirez joined Frank and Elaine with a quiet update. "Jason has confessed," she said softly. According to his statement, he had held Alicia at the cottage for several days after taking her. His obsession had grown ever since their brief time together in school. When Alicia began dating Brandon Knox and pulled away, Jason couldn't accept it. He promised her they could make their relationship public, if only she would break things off with Brandon and tell people she had left town alone to celebrate graduation. But Alicia refused. Detective Ramirez explained gently. She told him that after years of trying to care for him, after convincing herself he could change, she'd finally realized the truth. He was beyond her help. Her voice remained steady, though everyone listening could hear the quiet weight beneath each word. "Jason told us her words shattered him," Ramirez continued. "He said they argued, and when Alicia tried to escape, the struggle moved toward the cliff's edge. According to his statement, she nearly managed to push him off." Frank closed his eyes as she went on. In a burst of rage, he overpowered her. He struck her multiple times with rocks, and when he realized what he'd done, he panicked. Instead of calling for help, he buried her body near the cliff. Amy covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I remember when she started asking me about him," she whispered, wondering if he could change. "I didn't understand it at the time. I knew she didn't like him. I had no idea they were involved." She turned to Frank and Elaine, voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. If I'd known, maybe I could have done something." Elaine reached for her hand. "Amy, this wasn't your fault," she said gently but firmly. "Jason was manipulative. Alicia thought she could help him, and he took advantage of her kindness." Retired Detective Ron Keller, who had worked the case for years, stood nearby and shook his head solemnly. "She never went public with their relationship," he said quietly, "and Jason didn't have a criminal record. At the time, all we had to go on was Brandon. He was her known boyfriend, and naturally, the focus was on him." Keller's voice tightened. "Jason just kept living his life, and no one ever looked his way again." As the boats docked that afternoon, Frank looked back across the ocean. The white hyacinths still floated on the surface, gently drifting where the sea met the sky. The pain hadn't vanished. It never would. But after 22 years of silence, the truth had spoken, and with it came a kind of peace. That evening, Frank and Elaine sat together on their back porch, the sky painted in hues of amber and violet. Between them, on a small wooden table, sat a photo of Alicia, not her polished senior portrait, but a candid shot of her on the beach, wind in her hair, laughing, alive. Elaine looked at the picture for a long time before finally speaking. "I think we can move forward now," she said softly, reaching for Frank's hand, "not by forgetting her, but by remembering who she truly was, full of joy, compassion, fire." Frank squeezed her hand gently. "She was so much like you, you know. That need to see the good in people, that belief that someone could change if they were just loved enough." Elaine smiled faintly, her eyes misting. "And she had your stubbornness. Once she believed someone was worth saving, there was no talking her out of it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars begin to bloom across the night sky. Their grief no longer felt like something that pulled them apart. It had become something they held together. "I keep thinking about how young she was," Frank said at last. "She still believed love could fix anything." Elaine nodded. "It's not a bad thing to believe. The world needs more people like her, people who see what others could be. Her mistake wasn't in believing someone could change. It was in thinking she could do it all on her own. Frank's voice dropped. I just wish she had told us about Jason. Maybe we could have helped her see the danger. We'll never know, Elaine said softly. But I do believe this. Wherever she is now, she knows how much we loved her, and that we never stopped looking. The stars above Mornington shimmered in the clear sky, and Frank let his mind drift back to the beginning, how it all started with a single note in a forgotten yearbook, a mention of a borrowed book, a trail Alicia had unknowingly left behind. The mystery of her disappearance had been solved, but the greater question, how to live with the loss, would take more time. Still, for the first time in decades, Frank felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: peace. Alicia wasn't lost anymore. She was part of the sea she loved, free, eternal, and carried in the hearts of those who had never stopped searching, and now they could begin to heal.